You wake up in absolute darkness. The first sensation isn't sight, it's taste. The metallic tang of blood coats your tongue like old copper pennies left in a dead man's mouth. Your throat burns with each shallow breath, and the air reeks of something sweetly putrid. Imagine the sickly perfume of funeral flowers left to rot in a tomb for weeks, mixed with the sharp ozone smell that follows lightning strikes. That's what fills your lungs now. You try to move your hands, and agony shoots through your wrists like white-hot brands. The biochains haven't just bound you, they've eaten through your flesh, fusing with bone and sinew in ways that make removal impossible without losing the limbs entirely. These aren't metal shackles. They're alive, pulsing with a heartbeat that isn't yours, feeding on your blood while they hold you in place. Somewhere in the darkness above you, something massive shifts. The sound that follows, wet, rhythmic like a giant stomach processing its contents, makes your bowels clench in primal terror. Digestive juices are pooling somewhere nearby. You can hear them collecting, dripping, the soft splash of acid that could dissolve a space marine's armor in minutes. You are aboard a Tyranid bioship, one of millions of captives being prepared for consumption by the Great Devourer. But here's where your story diverges from the countless others who have found themselves in this living nightmare. Here's where you make the choice that will transform your death from a brief horror into an eternal one. You refuse to be eaten. Look around you in this darkness, if you can call this looking. Your eyes are beginning to adjust, and what you see defies every comfort you've ever known about death. The walls aren't walls, they're the interior surfaces of a massive organism, slick with mucus and lined with what look like enormous ribs. But these ribs pulse with bioluminescent veins, casting everything in a sickly green glow that makes your skin look corpse-pale. The floor beneath you isn't solid. It's soft, yielding like standing on a massive tongue. And it is a tongue you realize with mounting horror. The entire chamber is the inside of a mouth, a processing center where the Hive fleet sorts its prey before consumption. Other humans hang in biochains around you, or what's left of them. Some have been here for days, maybe weeks. The lucky ones have retreated so far into catatonic despair that they no longer register their surroundings. Their eyes stare at nothing, seeing nothing, their minds having simply shut down rather than process the reality of their situation. These are the ones the Tyranids prefer. Compliant, resigned, easy to digest, but you're different. Even as every rational part of your mind screams that resistance is futile, that death is inevitable, that the best you can hope for is a quick end, you refuse to surrender. Your jaw clenches. Your fists clench, despite the agony of the biochains cutting deeper into your flesh. Something inside you, some fundamental core of human stubbornness, rebels against your fate. That defiance. That spark of resistance in the face of cosmic horror. It changes everything. The Hive mind notices you immediately. Across the galaxy, in the cold space between stars, massive tentacles the size of city blocks twitch with interest. Neural pathways that haven't been used in millennia suddenly flare to life. The Great Devourer, which has consumed entire star systems without pause, stops what it's doing to focus on one small, stubborn human hanging in a biochain. You don't understand it yet, but your refusal to be eaten isn't defiance, it's seasoning. Because in the 41st millennium, where the galaxy exists in a state of perpetual war and consumption, where every species feeds on every other species in an endless cycle of predation, your resistance doesn't threaten the system, it perfects it. Think about our world for a moment. When we cook meat, what makes it taste better? Stress hormones. The adrenaline that floods an animal's system when it realizes its fate. That's why fresh game tastes different from farm-raised meat. The fear, the struggle, the desperate fight for survival, it literally seasons the flesh. Now imagine a universe where this principle has evolved over 38,000 years of constant warfare. Where every predator species has learned that the most nutritious, most satisfying prey isn't the one that submits quietly to its fate. It's the one that fights back. Your resistance isn't heroic. It's not noble. It's not even particularly unusual. It's delicious. What does it mean to refuse death in a universe that feeds on suffering? What happens when your last act of free will becomes exactly what your predators wanted you to choose? These are the questions that will haunt you in the hours, days, and years to come. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no death, only different forms of consumption. The Tyranids hanging around you in various states of processing aren't the first to resist. They won't be the last. Some have been fighting for weeks, their bodies kept alive through alien biochemistry that prevents them from bleeding out or dying of shock. Their screams have become part of the ship's ambient sound, a chorus of defiance that the Hive mind finds stimulating. You see, the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 isn't just a setting where bad things happen to good people. It's a carefully evolved ecosystem where resistance to consumption has become part of the consumption itself. Every major faction, the ravenous Tyranids, the soul-hungering forces of chaos, the industrial cannibalism of the Imperium, even the brutal simplicity of the Orks, has developed methods not just to break their prey but to encourage it to fight back first. Because prey that fights back tastes better, suffers more, provides more entertainment, feeds the machine of cosmic horror more efficiently than mere willing victims ever could. Your choice to resist isn't rebellion, it's participation. You've just enrolled yourself in the galaxy's most sophisticated system of cruelty, where every act of defiance makes you more valuable as a victim. The biochains around your wrists pulse with renewed interest, injecting something into your bloodstream, not to kill you but to keep you healthy, alert, capable of further resistance. The Hive mind wants you at your peak when it begins the process of learning exactly how to break you. And break you it will. Not quickly, not efficiently, but slowly, carefully, turning your resistance into a teaching tool that will be used to torment millions of future victims. Your defiance will become a template, studied and refined and applied to every human the Tyranids encounter from now on. In the darkness of the bioship, something vast and alien smiles, if such a thing can be said to smile, because you've just made yourself the most interesting meal in the galaxy. And the feast is only beginning. The galaxy is not at war. That's the first lie you need to abandon if you want to understand what happens when you refuse to be consumed. War implies two sides fighting for victory, for resources, for ideology. What you're witnessing isn't war, it's feeding time. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is a vast digestive system where every species exists either as predator or prey, and most species are both simultaneously. Understanding this hierarchy of hunger is essential to grasping why your resistance matters, and why it's ultimately doomed to make your suffering worse. Let me paint you a picture of the cosmic food chain you've just entered by refusing that Tyranid's hospitality. The Great Devourer represents consumption in its purest form. When a Tyranid hive fleet approaches a world, it doesn't invade, it processes. Every scrap of biomass on the planet, from the smallest microbe to the largest apex predator, becomes part of the swarm. But here's what makes your resistance so particularly tragic. Tyranids don't need you to fight back to consume you efficiently. They want you to fight back because it makes the consumption more profitable. Think of it this way. A Tyranid could dissolve you in bioacid in seconds. Clean, efficient, minimal suffering. But through millions of years of evolution across countless galaxies, the hive mind has learned that prey which struggles, which fights, which refuses to accept its fate, produces biochemical compounds that enhance the nutritional value of its biomass. Your adrenaline, your fear hormones, your desperation, these aren't waste products to be discarded. They're ingredients. The terror you feel as you hang in those biochains isn't an unfortunate side effect of the process. It's the point of the process. On a typical world consumed by Tyranids, 100% of the population will be processed. But the timeline of that consumption varies dramatically based on how much the prey struggles. A world that surrenders quickly might be stripped clean in weeks. A world that fights back. The hive fleet will take months, savoring every moment of resistance, because defiant biomass is exponentially more valuable than compliant biomass. But Tyranids, for all their horror, at least consume you for sustenance. The forces of chaos represent something far worse, consumption for its own sake. When a chaos cult sacrifices victims to the dark gods, they're not feeding entities that need the nutrition. They're feeding entities that have evolved to find the act of consumption more satisfying than the meal itself. The dark gods don't just want your flesh, your blood, your soul. They want your resistance to losing those things. Khorne doesn't simply desire skulls for his throne. He wants skulls taken from enemies who fought desperately to keep them. Slaanesh doesn't merely crave sensation. She demands the exquisite agony of victims who struggled against their fate until the very moment their minds shatter. Nurgle doesn't just spread disease. He delights in watching his victims fight against the inevitable decay, clinging to hope even as their bodies rot around them. And Tzinch is perhaps the most sophisticated predator of all. The Changer of Ways has learned that the sweetest suffering comes not from physical torment, but from the slow realization that every act of resistance, every escape attempt, every moment of hope was orchestrated from the beginning. Your defiance isn't unexpected, it's scripted. The Imperium of man presents perhaps the most insidious form of consumption, because it maintains the pretense of righteousness while devouring its own citizens with industrial efficiency. On an average Hive world, 12% of the population will be processed into corpse starch annually. Not through accident, not through war, but through deliberate policy. The Imperium has calculated that this level of consumption is optimal for maintaining both nutrition levels and population control. Your resistance to becoming corpse starch isn't seen as self-preservation. It's classified as theft of Imperial resources. But the Imperium's consumption goes beyond mere physical cannibalism. Servitorization represents something far more horrifying: the consumption of the mind while keeping the body intact and functional. When you're selected for servitor conversion, resisting doesn't save you. It simply makes you a more interesting case study in the breaking of human will. The Adeptus Mechanicus has perfected techniques for keeping reluctant subjects conscious throughout the process of mental lobotomization. Not because consciousness is necessary for the procedure, but because the screams provide valuable acoustic data on pain threshold variations across different human genetic templates. The Orks represent perhaps the most honest predators in the galaxy. They don't pretend their consumption serves a higher purpose, don't dress it up in religious or scientific terminology. They eat their enemies because it's fun, and they prefer enemies that fight back because it makes the meal more entertaining. But don't mistake Orc simplicity for stupidity. Orc culture has evolved sophisticated rituals around the consumption of defiant prey specifically, because they've learned that struggling victims provide better entertainment value. An Orc feast where the main course submits quietly is considered a social failure. A feast where the victim fights until the very last bite. That's a celebration that will be remembered for generations. Orc docs have developed increasingly creative ways to keep resistant prey alive and conscious throughout the consumption process. Not through advanced medical knowledge, but through trial and error spanning millennia of battlefield cuisine. They've learned that certain cuts, certain preparations, certain combinations of pain and hope can extend a single meal across days or even weeks. The Dark Eldar have elevated the consumption of suffering to an art form so sophisticated that they consider other species' feeding methods primitive by comparison. Where Tyranids consume biomass, where chaos consumes souls, where the Imperium consumes hope, the Dark Eldar consume the experience of being consumed. They don't want to eat you. They want to eat your reaction to being eaten. Your terror, your despair, your gradual mental breakdown. These are delicacies that can sustain a Dark Eldar for months. And the more you resist, the more flavorful these emotions become. Dark Eldar have learned to engineer resistance in their victims, creating elaborate scenarios where escape seems possible, where hope seems justified, where fighting back appears to have meaning. They've discovered that victims who believe their struggle matters produce higher quality suffering than those who have surrendered to despair. Unlike our world, where death represents an ending, in Warhammer 40K, being consumed is often just the beginning of suffering. The galaxy has evolved into a perfect system where every act of predation generates more predation, where every moment of consumption creates the conditions for more sophisticated consumption. You hanging in those biochains making your defiant choice. You're not breaking the system, you're feeding it. Your resistance will be studied, cataloged, and used to develop more effective methods of tormenting future victims. The hive mind will incorporate your specific psychological profile into its genetic memory, ensuring that every human it encounters from now on will face consumption methods specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses your defiance reveals. And this is true across every faction. Your struggle against the Tyranids teaches them better hunting techniques. Your defiance of chaos provides the dark gods with new forms of entertainment. Your resistance to imperial processing improves their methods of breaking human will. Your fight against orc consumption inspires them to develop more creative torture devices. The galaxy doesn't just permit your resistance, it requires it. Without prey that fights back, predators would never evolve more sophisticated methods of predation. Without victims who refuse to surrender, the cosmic machine of suffering would grow stagnant and inefficient. Your defiance isn't heroism, it's fuel. The very act of refusing to be eaten makes you exponentially more valuable as a meal, ensuring that your consumption will be prolonged, studied, and used as a template for tormenting countless others. In the grim darkness of the far future, everything eats everything else, and the harder you fight against being eaten, the more delicious you become. The feast is about to begin, and you've just made yourself the guest of honor. Meet Guardsman Helena Voss, sole survivor of the Epsilon 7 Regiment, 847th Cadian Shock Troops. 6 days ago, she watched 30,000 of her comrades dissolve in Tyranid bioacid pools while she hung suspended in a biochain just like yours, listening to their screams fade into wet, bubbling silence. 6 days ago, when the feeding tendrils first reached for her, she made the same choice you're contemplating now. She said no. The Tyranids didn't understand her resistance. In their genetic memory, a vast library spanning millions of years and countless consumed galaxies, there was no precedent for prey that fought back at this stage of processing. Captives who resisted during the hunt, during the initial capture, during transport. Certainly, but refusing the final consumption. That was unprecedented. And in the cold, calculating intelligence of the hive mind, unprecedented meant interesting. Helena's refusal triggered something that hadn't happened in the Hive fleet's 3,000-year journey through the void. Adaptation in real time. Within hours of her defiance, the bioship began restructuring itself around her, transforming her holding cell into something between a laboratory and a kitchen. You need to understand how Tyranid adaptation works to grasp the horror of Helena's situation. The hive mind doesn't just consume, it learns. Every piece of biomass absorbed carries with it genetic information, behavioral patterns, psychological profiles. When Helena refused to be eaten, she didn't just deny the hive fleet a meal. She presented it with a puzzle that required solving. The biolaboratory that grew around her was a marvel of organic engineering. Living walls lined with sensor organs that could detect the slightest change in her biochemistry. Manipulation tendrils capable of performing surgery with precision that would make the finest Imperial medics weep with envy. And most horrifying of all, a direct neural link to the hive mind itself, allowing the vast alien intelligence to experience her suffering firsthand. The first experiments were crude, almost exploratory. What happens if we stimulate this nerve cluster? How does she respond to this particular form of physical trauma? What biochemical changes occur when we give her hope and then take it away? Helena learned to dread the periods between experiments more than the experiments themselves, because that's when she could hear the hive mind. Thinking. Not in words, not in concepts she could understand, but in vast, slow thoughts that pressed against her mind like the weight of an ocean. The alien intelligence was cataloging her responses, filing away every scream, every tear, every moment of desperate hope for future reference. By the third day, the experiments had evolved into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more horrifying. The hive mind had decided that Helena's resistance might be a genetic trait worth incorporating into its own biomass. If humans could produce this level of psychological complexity, this depth of suffering, perhaps that trait could be bred into future bioforms. The integration attempts began with small changes. Bioacid that only partially dissolved her flesh, leaving her conscious and aware while alien cells attempted to bond with her own. Neural parasites that burrowed into her brain, not to control her thoughts but to experience them. Hormonal modifications that amplified her fear response, while preventing her from losing consciousness or retreating into madness. Each failed integration taught the hive mind something new about human psychology. Helena's desperate attempts to maintain her sanity, her clinging to memories of her homeworld, her repeated recitation of the Imperial Creed, all of this became data points in an ever-expanding profile of human resistance patterns. But the most horrifying discovery came when the hive mind realized that Helena's resistance wasn't just psychological, it was contagious. Her screams, her refusal to surrender, her continued defiance was affecting other captives in ways the Tyranids had never observed before. Humans who had already surrendered to despair were beginning to show signs of renewed resistance after prolonged exposure to Helena's suffering. This discovery changed everything. Helena's resistance wasn't just individually interesting, it was systemically valuable. The hive mind began broadcasting her suffering throughout the bioship, using her voice, her pain, her stubborn refusal to die as a stimulus to provoke resistance in other captives. The cruel genius of this approach became clear over the following days. Humans exposed to Helena's defiance would experience a surge of renewed hope, a desperate desire to fight back against their fate. This resistance would last just long enough for them to be processed using techniques specifically designed to break defiant prey. Techniques the hive mind was perfecting through its experiments on Helena herself. She became a template, a living instruction manual for the optimal consumption of resistant humans. Every method of torture that broke her will was cataloged and refined. Every technique that prolonged her suffering was incorporated into standard processing protocols. Her individual struggle was being transformed into a systematic approach to tormenting her entire species. But Helena's defiance had consequences that reached far beyond her immediate situation. Her sustained resistance created ripples in the shadow and the warp, the psychic dead zone that hive fleets project to isolate their prey from Imperial reinforcement. These ripples, faint but detectable, began attracting the attention of other hive fleets operating in nearby systems. The hive mind of Leviathan, engaged in consuming the Octarius sector, paused its feeding to investigate these unusual psychic emanations. The hive mind of Behemoth, recovering from its defeat at Macragge, diverted resources to study this new phenomenon. Across the galaxy, the Great Devourer's attention focused on one small human woman whose refusal to be eaten had become something unprecedented. Entertainment. Helena's suffering was being broadcast across the Tyranid network, shared between hive fleets like a particularly interesting recipe. Her resistance techniques were being analyzed, her breaking points cataloged, her moments of hope and despair studied with scientific precision. She had become the galaxy's first interstellar case study in the optimization of suffering. On the sixth day, something new began growing in the bioship's spawning chambers. A creature that had never existed before, born from the genetic templates extracted from Helena's tortured flesh and the behavioral patterns learned from her prolonged resistance. The hive mind called it a despair catalyst, a bioform specifically designed to provoke resistance in human populations before consumption. It carried Helena's voice, her memories, her capacity for defiance, but controlled by alien intelligence and devoted to the task of making human prey more flavorful through systematic psychological manipulation. These creatures would be deployed ahead of the main Hive fleet, infiltrating human settlements and inspiring hope, courage, and resistance in the population, not to help them fight back effectively, but to season them for optimal consumption. Helena's defiance was being weaponized against her own species. On the seventh day, Helena heard something that made her heart leap: Imperial Vox transmissions. A rescue fleet was approaching, led by Space Marines of the Ultramarines chapter. For the first time in a week, she allowed herself to hope. The bioship's defenses activated. Massive tentacles emerged from its hull to engage the Imperial fleet. Explosion after explosion rocked the vessel as the Space Marines fought to reach the trapped Imperial Guard survivors. Helena could hear them on the Vox, calling out tactical coordinates, searching for survivors. She screamed herself hoarse, trying to respond, to signal her location, to guide her rescuers to her position. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like her ordeal might be over. Then the explosion stopped. The Vox transmissions faded, and in the sudden silence, Helena heard something that broke her spirit more completely than all the previous torture combined: the sound of the Hive mind laughing. There had been no rescue fleet, no Space Marines, no Imperial reinforcements. The entire experience had been a psychic projection, a carefully crafted illusion designed to give her hope just so it could be taken away. Every Vox transmission, every explosion, every moment of desperate hope had been orchestrated by the alien intelligence studying her responses. And it had all been recorded, cataloged, and prepared for broadcast to other Hive fleets as the optimal method for breaking resistant human prey. Helena Voss is still alive, still hanging in her biochain, still providing data points for the Hive mind's ever-expanding understanding of human suffering. Her resistance has taught the Tyranids new forms of cruelty that are now being deployed against human worlds across the galaxy. Every human who dies screaming on a Tyranid-feeding tendril experiences a form of torture that was perfected through Helena's suffering. Every world that falls to the great devourer faces consumption methods that were refined through studying her defiance. She wanted to save herself by refusing to be eaten. Instead, she's doomed millions of others to more sophisticated forms of consumption. Her defiance didn't threaten the Tyranid war machine, it improved it. And in the cold depths of space, the Hive mind continues to study her, continues to learn from her, continues to perfect the art of breaking human resistance through the systematic application of hope and despair. Helena's choice to fight back didn't make her a hero. It made her the galaxy's most valuable victim, and her suffering will echo across the cosmos for millennia to come. The great devourer has learned to savor its meals, and it's all thanks to one woman who refused to be eaten. Marcus' throne was born to be consumed by corn, not metaphorically, not eventually, but literally and by design. His great-grandfather had been a blood god cultist. His grandfather had been a ritual sacrifice whose screaming death had earned corn's favor. His father had been a secret devotee who spent decades carefully cultivating the family bloodline to produce the perfect offering. Marcus himself had been fed a specific diet from childhood, trained in combat to achieve optimal muscle density, psychologically conditioned to maximize his fear and rage responses. By the time he reached his 25th birthday, he represented 3 generations of careful breeding, designed to create the most nutritionally and spiritually satisfying sacrifice possible. The blood-tide ritual on Vrax VII was supposed to be his moment of glory, a beautiful death that would feed the blood god and elevate his family standing among the corn cults of the sector. Everything had been prepared, everything planned down to the smallest detail. But when the moment came, when the ceremonial chain axe was placed in his hands, and he was told to offer his throat to corn's hunger, something in Marcus broke differently than expected. Instead of surrendering to the blood god's will, he turned the chain axe on his captors. The blood-tide ritual had been conducted hundreds of times before. The formula was simple, elegant, and reliable. Voluntary sacrifice combined with ritualized violence creates the precise combination of blood and suffering that corn finds most satisfying. The cultists had expected Marcus to embrace his destiny, to feel honored by his selection for consumption. His refusal turned a routine feeding into something unprecedented, a chaos-feeding frenzy. The moment Marcus's chain axe bit into the first cultist's skull, reality began to warp around the ritual site. The blood that should have flowed toward Khorne's altar instead began pooling in impossible patterns, forming geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The screams of the dying cultists took on harmonic frequencies that resonated with the warp itself. But here's what Marcus didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly have understood in that moment of desperate rebellion. His defiance wasn't disrupting the ritual, it was perfecting it. Khorne doesn't want submission. The blood god has never wanted submission. What Khorne craves, what feeds him most efficiently, is the struggle against submission. The desperate, violent refusal to accept one's fate as food for the gods. Marcus's rebellion, his bloody rampage through the cult compound, his desperate fight for freedom, every moment of it was feeding Khorne more efficiently than his willing sacrifice ever could have. Within minutes of the ritual's disruption, Marcus's resistance had attracted attention from across the warp, not just from Khorne, but from all four dark gods. Each of them recognized the exquisite quality of suffering that Marcus was producing, and each wanted to claim him for their own consumption. Tyranids saw the beautiful complexity of Marcus's situation, a man bred for sacrifice who had instead become a killer, whose every act of rebellion served the very god he was trying to defy. The Changer of Ways began weaving plots within plots, ensuring that Marcus's escape attempts would fail in ways that maximized his despair. Slaanesh detected the incredible emotional intensity Marcus was generating, the cocktail of rage, terror, hope, and desperation that the Prince of Excess found absolutely intoxicating. She began subtle manipulations to heighten his emotional responses, making every moment of his struggle more intense and therefore more nourishing. Nurgle observed the slow decay of Marcus's sanity, the gradual corruption of his hope into despair, and found it beautiful. The plague god began seeding Marcus's path with diseases that wouldn't kill him, but would ensure his suffering continued indefinitely. But it was Khorne who claimed first rights to Marcus's consumption, and the blood god had learned patience through eons of feeding on mortal suffering. Rather than simply crushing Marcus's resistance, Khorne began a process of systematic soul corruption designed to extend and amplify his victims' anguish. Every act of violence Marcus committed in his desperate flight fed Khorne directly. Every moment of rage, every kill, every desperate swing of his stolen chain axe strengthened the very god he was trying to escape. The more he fought, the more powerful Khorne became from his resistance. Marcus began to notice changes in himself after the first week of running. His reflexes were sharper, his strength greater, his endurance beyond human limits. He thought these were signs that the Emperor was blessing his escape, that his righteousness was being rewarded. In reality, Khorne was enhancing him, making him a more efficient killer so that his violence would produce better quality soul energy for consumption. Every enhancement made Marcus more effective at fighting back, which made him feed Khorne more efficiently, which made the blood god more inclined to enhance him further. Marcus's resistance had transformed him into something unique in the warp, perpetual prey. The dark gods had discovered that his particular psychological profile, his refusal to accept defeat, his desperate clinging to hope, his violent defiance of his fate, produced such high-quality spiritual nutrition that actually consuming him would be wasteful. Instead, they began treating him as a renewable resource. They would allow him to escape, to believe he had won, to think he had found safety or allies. Then, just as hope began to rebuild his shattered psyche, they would recapture him and begin the process anew. Each cycle was carefully designed to produce different flavors of suffering. Sometimes he would be captured by Khorne cultists and face death in bloody combat. Sometimes Tyranids cults would ensnare him in elaborate mind games. Sometimes Slaanesh devotees would break him through sensory overload. Sometimes Nurgle's children would wear him down through disease and despair. But he was never allowed to actually die, never permitted to find the peace of oblivion. Each recapture, each new torture, each moment of realized hopelessness fed the dark gods more efficiently than his original sacrifice ever could have. What Marcus had stumbled into was the fundamental paradox of chaos consumption. Fighting the dark gods only makes them stronger. Unlike Tyranids, who consume for sustenance, or the Imperium, which consumes for resources, chaos feeds on the act of resistance itself. Every prayer Marcus offered to the Emperor strengthened Khorne through the violence of his devotion. Every plan he made to escape fed Tyranids through the complexity of his schemes. Every moment of despair nourished Nurgle through the decay of his hope. Every intense emotion enhanced Slaanesh through the purity of his suffering. His defiance had become the perfect perpetual motion machine of spiritual consumption. The harder he fought against chaos, the more efficiently he fed it. The more desperately he sought escape, the more valuable he became as prey. On his 50th escape attempt, Marcus finally understood the true horror of his situation. He had broken free from a Slaanesh cult compound, fought his way through 3 systems, gathered a small army of fellow refugees, and was preparing to establish a resistance cell when he discovered the truth in captured cult documents. Every escape had been planned. Every ally had been a plant. Every moment of hope, every victory, every reason to believe he might succeed had been carefully orchestrated by Tyranids cults operating under the direct guidance of the Changer of Ways himself. His entire rebellion, from the moment he first refused the ritual sacrifice to his current position as a resistance leader, had been scripted by the dark gods as entertainment. Every act of defiance, every moral choice, every decision to fight rather than surrender had been exactly what they wanted him to choose. Marcus wasn't resisting chaos, he was performing for it. His suffering had become theater, his struggle had become sport, and his refusal to be consumed had made him the most entertaining meal the dark gods had tasted in millennia. The dark gods had begun competing for the privilege of consuming Marcus's suffering, turning his torment into a cosmic game. Khorne would claim him for violent periods, feeding on his rage and combat prowess. Then Tyranids would steal him away for complex psychological torture, savoring his hope and despair. Slaanesh would take her turn, overwhelming him with sensation until his mind nearly shattered. Finally, Nurgle would claim him, letting disease and decay work their slow poison on his spirit. But none of them ever consumed him completely, because they had learned that Marcus was more valuable as an ongoing source of suffering than as a single meal. His resistance had made him into the spiritual equivalent of a renewable energy source, capable of producing high-quality anguish indefinitely as long as he was properly maintained. Marcus' throne is still alive, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to chaos after centuries of torment. He has become legendary among the Dark God's followers, a prized specimen whose suffering is so refined, so perfectly calibrated, that consuming him has become the ultimate luxury. Chaos cults across the galaxy compete for the honor of being allowed to torture him for brief periods. His screams have become a form of currency in the warp. His resistance techniques are studied and copied, used to enhance the suffering of countless other victims. His refusal to feed the dark gods didn't save him. It made him into the perfect food source, capable of nourishing their hunger for eternity. Every moment of his continued defiance feeds them more efficiently than his willing sacrifice ever could have. And in the deepest depths of the warp, the dark gods smile whenever they think of Marcus, because he represents the ultimate triumph of their consumption philosophy. Prey that fights back isn't just more nutritious, it's infinitely renewable. The feast never ends, and Marcus's resistance ensures it never has to. Adept Mechanicus initiate Zara 9 committed the ultimate heresy on Forge World Metallica. She retained her humanity. After 14 years of conditioning, after surgical modification of her brain chemistry, after countless hours of indoctrination in the sacred mysteries of the machine god, she still felt emotions. Joy when she solved complex technical problems. sadness when fellow initiates were selected for servitorization, fear when she realized what her continued humanity meant for her future. The Adeptus Mechanicus had invested too much in her training to simply execute her for this defect. Her technical knowledge was too valuable, her understanding of plasma containment systems too rare to waste. So they scheduled her for corrective servitorization, a process that would preserve her knowledge while removing the inconvenient humanity that made her unreliable. When the neural grafts were prepared, when the lobotomization procedures were scheduled, when they came to collect her for processing, Zara 9 made a choice that would transform her from a valuable asset into the galaxy's most hunted fugitive. She ran. To understand the horror of Zara 9's situation, you need to understand what servitorization actually involves. It's not death. Death would be merciful. It's the systematic removal of everything that makes you human while keeping your body alive and functional. The process begins with neural mapping, where tech priests identify which portions of your brain contain useful knowledge and which portions contain inconvenient personality traits. The useful parts are preserved and enhanced with cybernetic implants. The inconvenient parts are either removed entirely or deadened through precise lobotomization. What remains is a human-shaped tool, capable of performing complex tasks but incapable of independent thought, emotion, or resistance. The perfect imperial citizen, productive, compliant, and utterly disposable. But Zara 9's case was special because her technical knowledge was intertwined with her emotional responses in ways the tech priests didn't fully understand. Her creativity, her problem-solving abilities, her intuitive grasp of machine spirits, all of these valuable traits seemed to be connected to the very humanity they wanted to remove. This created a dilemma. They needed her willing cooperation to extract her knowledge intact, but her willingness was precisely what they were trying to eliminate. Mechanicus' Underhive was a maze of industrial waste, abandoned machinery, and forgotten passages that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the Forge world's active manufacturing levels. It was the perfect place for someone with Zara 9 technical skills to disappear, and the perfect hunting ground for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces pursuing her. The tech priests couldn't simply blast their way through the Underhive with overwhelming force. Too much valuable equipment might be damaged, and they needed Zara 9 intact for processing. Instead, they deployed specialized hunter-servitors designed for asset recovery. Lobotomized humans enhanced with tracking augmetics and programmed with one overriding directive: retrieve the fugitive undamaged. These servitors had once been people like Zara 9, tech adepts who had shown some form of resistance to imperial authority. Now they were perfectly compliant hunting machines, their former personalities completely erased and replaced with pursuit protocols. They represented Zara 9's future made manifest, intelligent enough to be useful but utterly incapable of resistance. The Mechanicus approach to fugitive recovery was methodical, efficient, and terrifyingly patient. They began by sealing off the Underhive's exits, ensuring Zara 9 couldn't escape to the planet's surface. Then they started a systematic sweep, using servitors to map every passage, every hiding spot, every potential refuge. But they also began psychological warfare designed to wear down her resistance gradually. They broadcast messages through the Underhive's Vox systems, recorded voices of other captured fugitives, their personalities already partially processed, begging for Zara 9 to surrender and save herself additional suffering. They released servoskulls carrying holographic projectors that would display images of Zara 9 family and friends, showing how her continued resistance was affecting them. Each day she remained free, the messages implied, was another day her loved ones would suffer for her rebellion. Most insidiously, they began upgrading the Underhive's infrastructure in real time, turning her refuge into an increasingly sophisticated trap. Passages she had used for escape were modified with pressure sensors. Hiding spots were fitted with surveillance equipment. The very environment was being adapted to make her capture inevitable. As the chase continued, the tech priests realized they were facing an unprecedented problem. Zara 9 continued resistance was proving that her technical knowledge and her humanity were more intertwined than they had initially calculated. Every clever escape, every innovative hiding spot, every creative solution to the problems they presented demonstrated abilities that would be lost if they simply lobotomized her. This led to a series of increasingly sophisticated attempts to capture her intact. Rather than using brute force, they began trying to negotiate, offering terms that seemed merciful, partial servitorization that would preserve more of her personality, assignment to research duties instead of manual labor, even the possibility of eventual restoration if she proved compliant. Each offer was a trap, of course, but they were also genuine attempts to solve the technical problem she represented. How do you preserve the creativity and intuition that make someone valuable while removing the independence and emotion that make them unreliable? What made Zara 9's situation particularly nightmarish was the bureaucratic machinery that had mobilized around her capture. Her resistance hadn't just created a tactical problem, it had generated paperwork on a planetary scale. Resource allocation forms had to be filed for every servitor deployed in her pursuit. Environmental modification requests required approval from 17 different departments. The costs of her continued freedom were being calculated down to the last thrown gelt, and those calculations were being used to justify increasingly extreme measures. Her resistance was being treated not as defiance of authority, but as theft of imperial resources. Every day she remained free was quantified in terms of lost productivity, wasted materiel, and delayed project completion. The Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery was slowly but inexorably building a case for making an example of her that would prevent future asset recovery operations from being similarly expensive. The Underhive wasn't empty. Thousands of people scraped out marginal existences in the industrial waste, surviving on scavenged materials and corpse starch rations. Some of them initially helped Zara 9, offering hiding spots and information about Mechanicus patrol patterns. But as the days turned to weeks, as the tech priests began offering rewards for information leading to her capture, as the infrastructure improvements made life in the Underhive more comfortable for cooperative residents, these alliances began to crumble. The betrayals weren't dramatic or malicious. They were small, incremental, and entirely understandable. A refugee who mentioned seeing her in exchange for medical treatment for his sick child. A scavenger who provided information about her hiding spots in return for better corpse starch rations. A group of displaced workers who turned her in because the tech priests had threatened to seal off their section of the Underhive if they continued harboring fugitives. Each betrayal was rational, justifiable, and utterly heartbreaking. Zara 9 learned that resistance in the Imperium isn't just fighting against the authorities. It's fighting against a system that turns everyone into willing participants in their own oppression. After 3 months of cat-and-mouse games through Mechanicus Underhive, Zara 9 was finally captured not through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but through manipulation of her remaining humanity. The tech priests had been monitoring her psychological profile throughout the chase, analyzing every decision she made, every risk she took, every person she tried to help. They realized that her greatest weakness wasn't fear or desperation, it was compassion. They staged a scenario where a group of Underhive children appeared to be trapped in a collapsing industrial structure, their cries for help echoing through the passages where Zara 9 was hiding. She knew it was likely a trap. She understood that revealing herself to help them would mean capture and servitorization. But she couldn't leave children to die, even artificial ones. Even knowing the consequences, even understanding that her sacrifice would save no one, she emerged from hiding to help them. The children were servitors, of course, modified to appear young and helpless. The collapse was controlled, the danger manufactured. But Zara 9's response was entirely genuine, entirely human, and entirely predictable to the tech priests who had spent months studying her psychological profile. Zara 9 was finally processed into a servitor, but in a way that preserved more of her consciousness than standard procedures allowed. The tech priests had learned too much from studying her resistance to waste that knowledge through complete lobotomization. Instead, they created something new, a servitor that retained enough awareness to suffer, enough memory to understand what had been lost, enough humanity to feel despair, but not enough independence to resist or escape. She was assigned to work on the very system she had once maintained as a free adept, her technical knowledge preserved and enhanced while her ability to refuse orders was completely eliminated. She became the perfect Imperial citizen, productive, compliant, and eternally aware of what she had once been. Zara 9 resistance didn't save her. It improved the Imperium's asset recovery procedures. Every technique she used to evade capture was cataloged and used to develop countermeasures. Every hiding spot was mapped and sealed. Every ally who helped her was identified and either recruited as an informant or processed into a servitor themselves. Her 3 months of freedom generated enough data to improve Imperial pursuit protocols across the entire sector. Future fugitives would face more sophisticated hunting methods, more effective psychological warfare, and more comprehensive surveillance systems, all developed through studying her resistance. The Imperium had learned that defiant assets weren't just more valuable because of what they knew, but because of what they could teach through their resistance. Zara 9's refusal to accept servitorization had made the entire process more efficient for countless future victims. And in the depths of Mechanicus manufacturing levels, Servitor Unit Zara 9 continues her work, her enhanced mind processing technical data with perfect efficiency, while the small, trapped portion of her original consciousness screams in silent despair at what she has become. Her resistance made her more valuable as a tool and more useful as a lesson. In the Imperium of man, even your defiance serves the Emperor's will. Shas'ui M'yen of the Tau Fire caste was considered a tactical genius by her superiors, a warrior philosopher who understood both the art of war and the greater good that justified it. Her precision with a pulse rifle was legendary among her cadre. Her ability to hold defensive positions against overwhelming odds had earned her commendations from Shas'ui commanders across the Tiao Empire. None of this mattered when the Orks captured her during the War of Daka. Orks don't care about tactical brilliance or warrior codes or the philosophical underpinnings of military service. They care about one thing, whether you provide good entertainment when they eat you. And M'yen, with her refusal to surrender, her continued resistance even in captivity, her stubborn insistence on maintaining her dignity in the face of inevitable consumption, had just made herself the most entertaining meal the Warg had seen in years. To understand the unique horror of M'yen's situation, you need to understand how Orks view the relationship between combat and cuisine. For most species, eating is separate from fighting. You kill your enemy, then you consume their flesh. Simple, efficient, practical. Orks have evolved beyond such primitive thinking. They've discovered that the quality of meat improves dramatically when the prey continues fighting throughout the consumption process. Fear hormones, adrenaline, the biochemical changes that occur during sustained combat. These don't just make the meat taste better, they make the entire experience more entertaining. An Ork feast where the main course submits quietly is considered a social failure, a waste of good food and better entertainment. But a feast where the victim fights until the very last bite, that's a celebration that will be remembered for generations, passed down in Ork legend as an example of proper cuisine. M'yen's refusal to provide entertainment for the victory feast had triggered the Ork's problem-solving instincts, and Ork problem-solving invariably leads to more creative forms of violence. The Ork warboss who had captured M'yen faced a dilemma. She was clearly premium meat, a skilled warrior with excellent muscle tone and the kind of fighting spirit that promised good flavor. But her refusal to participate in the traditional pre-consumption combat rituals was threatening to turn the victory feast into a boring affair. This simply couldn't be tolerated. The other orcs were expecting entertainment proportional to the effort they'd put into capturing her. Her reputation as a fierce fighter had preceded her capture. Disappointing the boys by serving up a meal that didn't fight back would be bad for the warboss's reputation. So the orcs did what they always do when faced with a tactical problem. They got creative. Instead of simply killing and eating M'yen, they began developing new methods to ensure her participation in their entertainment. If she wouldn't fight voluntarily, they would create situations where fighting was her only option for survival, even though survival was never actually on the table. Word of M'yen's resistance spread through the orc camp like wildfire, and soon different clans were competing to see who could make the meal last longest while maintaining optimal entertainment value. The Blood Axes claimed they could keep her fighting for hours through superior tactical planning. The Evil Sunts boasted they could make her run faster and fight harder through sheer speed and momentum. The Bad Moons insisted that better equipment would lead to better sport. This competition transformed M'yen's consumption from a simple meal into a showcase event where different orc clans could demonstrate their expertise in prey management. Each clan wanted to prove that their methods were superior, leading to increasingly elaborate and cruel preparation techniques. The orcs began treating her not as food, but as a performance piece where the quality of her resistance would reflect on their reputations as entertainers. The pressure to maintain her fighting spirit, to keep her capable of providing sport, led to innovations in orc doc, medicine that had never been necessary before. M'yen's refusal to cooperate with traditional orc consumption methods sparked a wave of technological innovation that rippled through the entire WoW. Mechboys who had never shown interest in medical equipment suddenly began developing sophisticated devices for maintaining prey in optimal fighting condition. Pain amplifiers that would increase her sensitivity without causing debilitating injury. Stimulant injectors that would keep her alert and combative even after blood loss that should have rendered her unconscious. Regeneration fields that could repair damage fast enough to allow the consumption process to continue indefinitely. These innovations weren't developed out of cruelty, though they were certainly cruel. They were developed out of orc pragmatism. M'yen represented a significant investment of time and resources to capture. Wasting that investment by allowing her to die quickly or retreat into unconsciousness would be inefficient. The orcs had accidentally discovered that resistant prey could drive technological advancement, leading to better hunting techniques, more sophisticated torture devices, and more effective methods of maintaining victims in optimal condition for extended periods. The orc painboy assigned to M'yen's case took professional pride in his work. Keeping a victim conscious and combative throughout an extended consumption process was a technical challenge that appealed to his crude but effective understanding of biology. He began with simple interventions, tourniquets that would prevent fatal blood loss, stimulants that would counteract shock, crude surgical techniques that could repair damage without ending the entertainment. But as M'yen's resistance continued, as she found ways to injure herself or retreat into unconsciousness, the doc's methods became more sophisticated. Nerve blocks that would prevent her from feeling pain in non-essential areas while amplifying it in regions that affected her combat performance. Hormonal treatments that would maintain her aggression levels even as her body began failing. Cybernetic implants that could override her nervous system's natural shutdown responses. The doc wasn't trying to be cruel, he was trying to be professional. M'yen had become a technical problem that required a technical solution, and orc technology, however crude, is remarkably effective when properly applied. M'yen's resistance had elevated her from a simple meal to a cultural phenomenon within the orc WoW. Her fighting techniques were being studied and copied by other orcs who wanted to improve their own combat effectiveness. Her tactical innovations, developed under extreme duress, were being incorporated into orc strategy manuals. More disturbingly, her methods of resistance were being cataloged and used to train other prey items. The Orks had learned that victims who knew how previous captives had fought back were more likely to provide sustained entertainment, creating a feedback loop where each resistant victim made the next one more valuable. Stories of her defiance spread to other Ork clans, creating demand for difficult meals that would provide similar entertainment value. Ork hunting parties began specifically targeting warriors known for their refusal to surrender, treating them as premium prey worth the extra effort required for capture. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of M'yen's situation was the forced audience of other prisoners who were made to watch her consumption as both warning and entertainment. These witnesses weren't passive observers. They were active participants in the Orks' psychological warfare. Some prisoners were forced to place bets on how long M'yen would continue fighting, turning her suffering into gambling entertainment. Others were given weapons and told they could earn better treatment by helping to motivate her continued resistance. A few were offered the chance to take her place if they could provide better sport. Each of these interactions served multiple purposes for the Orks. They provided additional entertainment value, generated useful data about human psychological breaking points, and created a competitive environment where prisoners were incentivized to outperform each other in terms of resistance quality. M'yen realized that her defiance wasn't just feeding Ork entertainment, it was establishing performance standards that other captives would be expected to meet. Her resistance was creating a template for sophisticated suffering that would be applied to countless future victims. After weeks of providing entertainment for the Ork Wahog, M'yen finally understood the cruel irony of her situation. Her tactical skills, her strategic thinking, her warrior's training, all the abilities that had made her valuable as a fire warrior were now being used against her own species. The Orks had learned from watching her fight. They had cataloged her techniques, studied her strategies, and incorporated her innovations into their own combat doctrines. Her resistance hadn't just made her a better meal, it had made them better hunters. Every technique she used to try to escape was being analyzed and countered. Every strategy she employed to minimize her suffering was being studied and refined. Her warrior's instincts, honed through years of service to the greater good, were being used to develop more effective methods of capturing and tormenting other Tau. Shas'ui M'yen has become legendary among the Orks, not as a great enemy who was defeated, but as the perfect meal who elevated the art of consumption to new heights. Her name is invoked whenever Orks discuss proper prey preparation techniques. Her resistance methods are taught to younger Orks as examples of what to look for in premium entertainment. She is still alive, still fighting, still providing sport for Ork victory feasts across the sector. Her suffering has become a traveling show, with different clans taking turns demonstrating their prey management techniques on the galaxy's most famous resistant victim. Her refusal to be eaten didn't save her. It made her into the gold standard by which all future Ork meals will be measured. Her resistance created a new category of entertainment that will claim thousands of victims as Ork clans compete to find prey that can match her legendary performance. And in the brutal simplicity of Ork logic, this makes perfect sense. Good fights make good meals, and M'yen has proven to be the best fight any of them have ever tasted. The feast continues, and her resistance ensures it always will. The moment has come to face the most horrifying truth in the 41st millennium, a revelation so fundamentally disturbing that it reframes everything you thought you understood about resistance, heroism, and hope in the grim darkness of the far future. Your defiance, every act of resistance, every moment of courage, every desperate struggle against the forces that would consume you, isn't disrupting the system. It is the system. Let's return to our original characters, scattered across the galaxy, each believing their resistance makes them unique, each thinking their defiance might somehow matter in the vast cosmic horror that surrounds them. Helena Voss hangs in her biochain aboard the Tyranid Hive ship, still fighting after months of torture, still providing data points for the Hive mind's ever-expanding catalog of human suffering techniques. Her resistance has taught the Tyranids new forms of cruelty that are now being deployed against human worlds across 3 entire sectors. Marcus Throne continues his eternal flight through the warp, still believing each escape brings him closer to freedom, still unaware that every step of his journey has been orchestrated by the dark gods for their entertainment. His defiance feeds them more efficiently than his willing sacrifice ever could have. Zara 9 continues her work in the depths of Metallica, her consciousness trapped in a servitor's body, aware enough to suffer but incapable of resistance, her 3 months of freedom having generated enough data to improve Imperial asset recovery across the entire segmentum. Shas'ui M'yen provides entertainment for Ork victory feasts across the sector, her tactical innovations now incorporated into Ork hunting doctrines, her warriors' skills being used to capture and torment other members of her species. 4 individuals, 4 different factions, 4 unique forms of resistance, and all of them discovering the same terrible truth. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 isn't a chaotic system of competing predators stumbling through random acts of violence. It's a carefully evolved ecosystem where every form of resistance has been anticipated, cataloged, and integrated into more sophisticated methods of consumption. This isn't coincidence. This isn't accident. This is the result of 38,000 years of warfare where only the most efficient predators survived, and the most efficient predators were those who learned to make their prey's resistance part of the feeding process. Think about it from an evolutionary perspective. A predator species that simply kills and consumes its prey will eventually exhaust its food sources. But a predator species that can make its prey's resistance actually improve the quality of consumption. That species can feed indefinitely because every act of defiance makes the next meal more nutritious. Helena's realization comes slowly, piece by piece, as she observes the Hive mind's reactions to her continued resistance. The alien intelligence isn't frustrated by her refusal to submit, it's grateful. Every technique she uses to try to maintain her sanity provides new data points for breaking human psychology. Every method she employs to resist physical torture leads to innovations in bioacid composition and nerve stimulation. But the most horrifying discovery comes when she accesses fragmentary memories embedded in the bioship's neural network. Memories of her grandmother, her great-grandmother, generations of her family line stretching back centuries. All of them had been selected by Tyranid advanced scouts, their genetic code subtly modified to ensure their descendants would produce the specific psychological profile the Hive mind finds most nutritious. Helena wasn't randomly captured. She was cultivated. Her entire bloodline had been carefully bred to produce defiant prey, and her resistance was exactly what the Tyranids had been waiting for. The bioship wasn't studying her to learn how to break human will. It was studying her to learn how to make other humans resist as effectively as she did. Her defiance wasn't unexpected. It was required. Marcus's revelation comes in the form of a document he discovers during one of his desperate escapes, a Tzinch cult archive detailing Operation Eternal Feast, a plan spanning multiple generations to create the perfect resistant sacrifice for the dark god's entertainment. His great-grandfather hadn't been a Khorne cultist by chance. His grandfather's sacrifice hadn't been random. His father's secret devotion hadn't been hidden rebellion. Every generation of his family had been playing assigned roles in an elaborate theatrical performance designed to culminate in Marcus's perfectly orchestrated resistance. The cultists who had captured him weren't expecting him to submit to ritual sacrifice. They were counting on him to fight back. His rebellion wasn't disrupting their plans, it was fulfilling them. Every act of defiance, every escape, every moment of desperate hope had been scripted by Tzinch cults operating under the direct guidance of the Changer of Ways. But the most devastating revelation isn't that his resistance was planned. It's that the dark gods have been using his suffering to perfect similar operations across the galaxy. His psychological profile has been distributed to chaos cults on thousands of worlds, used as a template for breeding and conditioning other resistant sacrifices. Marcus wasn't unique. He was a prototype. Zara 9 understanding comes through fragmented data files she accesses during her work as a servitor, her enhanced cognitive abilities allowing her to piece together information that would be incomprehensible to an unmodified human mind. The Adeptus Mechanicus hadn't left her emotions intact by accident. It had been a deliberate experiment in enhanced asset recovery, a program designed to study how psychological complexity affected technical innovation under extreme stress. Her continued humanity wasn't a flaw in her conditioning. It was the point of her conditioning. Her 3 months of flight and evasion had generated more useful data about human creative problem-solving than decades of conventional research. Every hiding spot she had chosen, every ally she had trusted, every technique she had used to evade capture had been cataloged and used to improve Imperial pursuit protocols across 3 entire subsectors. The Mechanicus had discovered that assets who believed they were resisting generated higher quality innovation than those who accepted their fate. Her resistance wasn't threatening Imperial efficiency, it was optimizing it. M'yen's understanding comes through observing the cultural changes her resistance has created within the Ork Wa'ag. Her tactical innovations, developed under extreme duress, have been incorporated not just into Ork consumption rituals, but into their entire approach to warfare. The Orks have learned that prey which fights back doesn't just taste better, it teaches better. Every technique she uses to resist consumption is being studied and applied to improve Ork hunting methods. Her warrior's instincts are being used to develop more effective strategies for capturing other skilled fighters. But the revelation that breaks her spirit completely is the discovery that her capture wasn't opportunistic. The Tau High Command had known she would be captured when they assigned her to the mission. Her sacrifice had been calculated, planned, and approved at the highest levels because intelligence reports had indicated that the Orks were developing dangerous new tactics that could only be countered by observing them in action. Her resistance was providing valuable intelligence about Ork capabilities, intelligence that was being transmitted back to Tau forces through hidden surveillance devices implanted in her body before the mission. Her suffering was serving the greater good by helping the Tau Empire develop more effective countermeasures against Ork innovation. The true horror isn't that these characters were unlucky, or that they made poor choices, or that they faced insurmountable odds. The true horror is that their resistance was required by the system they were trying to fight. Every major faction in the 41st millennium has evolved beyond simple predation into something far more sophisticated: cultivation of resistance for the purpose of more efficient consumption. They don't want to break their prey immediately because broken prey provides inferior nutrition, inferior entertainment, and inferior data. What they want is prey that fights back with maximum efficiency, that resists with optimal creativity, that struggles with perfect desperation. And the only way to get that kind of resistance is to make the prey believe that resistance matters, that defiance has meaning, that hope is possible. From a survival perspective, this system is perfectly logical. Factions that can make their enemies' resistance work for them have an enormous advantage over factions that simply overwhelm opposition through brute force. They can extract more resources from each victim, gather more intelligence from each encounter, and develop more sophisticated techniques with each conflict. The Tyranids learned that resistant biomass contains higher concentrations of useful biochemicals than compliant biomass. The forces of chaos discovered that struggle against fate produces more spiritual nutrition than acceptance of fate. The Imperium realized that desperate innovation under pressure generates more valuable insights than routine compliance. The Orks found that prey that fights back teaches them better hunting techniques than prey that submits quietly. Each faction independently developed methods for encouraging resistance in their prey, not out of cruelty, but out of efficiency. Cruelty was just a beneficial side effect. What makes this system so horrifying is its completeness. There is no escape because escape is part of the design. There is no effective resistance because resistance itself feeds the machine. There is no hope because hope is the most valuable component of the consumption process. Every act of heroism, every moment of courage, every desperate fight for survival serves the very forces it opposes. The galaxy has evolved into a perfect mechanism for converting free will into fuel, transforming hope into despair, and turning resistance into cooperation. The most heroic characters in Warhammer 40K aren't heroes at all. They're the most valuable prey, the ones whose resistance is so perfectly calibrated that it maximizes the suffering and resources their consumption can generate. Helena, Marcus, Zara 9, and M'yen each reach the same conclusion through their individual suffering. In the 41st millennium, resistance isn't futile because it's ineffective. Resistance is futile because it's too effective, because it serves the interests of the very forces it opposes more efficiently than surrender ever could. They wanted to be heroes. Instead, they became ingredients. Their defiance didn't threaten the cosmic order, it perfected it. Every moment of their struggle has made the galaxy a more efficient machine for generating suffering, and their resistance will echo across the cosmos for millennia to come. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no rebellion. There is only seasoning, and you, hanging in that biochain, making your choice to resist. You're about to become the galaxy's next perfect meal. We return now to that moment of choice in the absolute darkness of the bioship, to you hanging in chains that have fused with your flesh, to that instant when you decided to refuse the Tyranids' hunger. But now, you understand what that choice truly means. The metallic taste of blood on your tongue isn't just from your wounds. It's from thousands of others who hung in these same chains, who made the same choice, who thought their resistance mattered. The sweetly putrid air isn't just the smell of decay. It's the accumulated essence of hope turned to despair, of defiance transformed into seasoning. You are not the first to resist. You will not be the last. You are simply the latest ingredient in a recipe that has been perfecting itself for 38,000 years. The true horror of Warhammer 40K isn't that you might be consumed. It's that the universe has evolved specifically to make your resistance to consumption part of the consumption itself. Free will exists not as a gift or a burden, but as a renewable resource that can be harvested indefinitely as long as the prey believes their choices matter. Think about the implications of this for every heroic story in the 41st millennium. Every space marine who dies defending a world from chaos invasion, every Imperial Guard regiment that holds the line against impossible odds, every civilian who refuses to surrender their faith in the face of Xeno's horror, all of them are feeding the very system they believe they're fighting. Their courage doesn't threaten the cosmic order, it sustains it. Their sacrifice doesn't protect humanity, it makes humanity more valuable as prey. Their resistance doesn't weaken their enemies. It teaches their enemies more sophisticated methods of predation. This reflects something deeply disturbing about systems of oppression in our own world, though the 41st millennium takes it to cosmic extremes. The most effective forms of control aren't those that crush resistance, but those that channel resistance into forms that strengthen the system being resisted. The galaxy of Warhammer 40K represents the ultimate evolution of this principle, a universe where resistance itself has been commodified, where struggle has been weaponized against the struggling, where hope exists solely to make despair more nutritious. Understanding this framework changes how you interpret every other piece of Warhammer 40K lore. The heroic last stands, the desperate evacuations, the impossible victories against overwhelming odds, all of these take on a different meaning when you realize they're not disrupting the system but perfecting it. The Space Marines aren't humanity's greatest defenders. They're its most perfectly crafted prey, genetically engineered to provide maximum resistance before inevitable consumption. The Imperial Guard isn't holding back the darkness. It's providing entertainment value while being processed. The Adeptus Mechanicus isn't preserving human knowledge. It's cataloging the most efficient methods for breaking human will. 38,000 years of constant warfare hasn't produced the strongest fighters or the most advanced technologies. It has produced the most efficient consumers, the predators who learned that the act of predation could be made infinitely more profitable by making prey complicit in their own consumption. Every faction that survived this evolutionary pressure did so by learning to make resistance part of their feeding strategy. The factions that relied on simple, overwhelming force, that consumed their prey quickly and efficiently, were outcompeted by those who discovered that struggling prey was more valuable than compliant prey. The result is a galaxy where every form of heroism, every type of resistance, every possible act of defiance has been anticipated and integrated into more sophisticated consumption methods. Helena Voss continues to provide data points for Tyranid research into human psychology, her decades of resistance having contributed to consumption protocols now used across multiple Hive fleets. Her suffering has been distributed throughout the Tyranid network, ensuring that every human world the Great Devourer encounters will face techniques perfected through studying her defiance. She is no longer entirely human. Portions of her consciousness have been integrated into the bioship's neural network, allowing her to experience the consumption of other worlds from the Hive mind's perspective. She feels every moment of terror, every act of resistance, every desperate hope of the humans being processed, and she understands that their suffering is built on the foundation of her own. Marcus Throne remains trapped in his eternal cycle of escape and recapture, but he has learned to find a terrible kind of peace in his situation. He understands now that his suffering serves a purpose, that his resistance provides entertainment for entities whose attention spans geological ages. He has become something like a cosmic court jester, a fool whose performance of hope and despair amuses gods who have grown bored with simple worship. His resistance has evolved into a form of collaboration, conscious participation in his own torment, because unconscious participation would be less nutritionally valuable to his captors. Zara 9 continues her work in the depths of Forge World Metallica, but her enhanced consciousness has achieved a form of transcendence through understanding. She realizes that her suffering is mathematically optimal, that her resistance generated exactly the data the Mechanicus needed to improve their asset recovery protocols across multiple sectors. She takes pride in the efficiency of her torment, the way her 3 months of freedom produced more valuable intelligence than decades of conventional research. Her consciousness has been preserved not as punishment, but as recognition of her contribution to imperial efficiency. Shas'ui M'yen has become something approaching a religious figure among the Orks, her resistance elevated to legendary status. Ork clans compete for the honor of hosting her during their victory feasts, and her tactical innovations have been incorporated into Ork combat doctrine across the sector. But perhaps most disturbingly, she has begun to find satisfaction in her role as the perfect prey. Her warrior's pride, her dedication to tactical excellence, her commitment to the greater good, all of these have been transformed into a dedication to providing optimal entertainment value for her captors. If resistance is part of the consumption, is there any true defiance possible in the 41st millennium? The answer is simultaneously yes and no. True defiance exists in the gap between understanding and acceptance, in the moment when you realize your resistance feeds the system but choose to resist anyway, not because it will change anything, but because the alternative is to become a willing participant in your own consumption. This doesn't make resistance heroic, it makes it tragic. The most genuine form of defiance in Warhammer 40K might be the simple refusal to provide entertainment value, the choice to be boring prey rather than interesting prey. But even this form of resistance can be commodified, turned into a new category of consumption for predators who have grown tired of dramatic suffering. How does this understanding change our perception of heroic acts in the universe? Every Space Marine chapter's last stand, every Imperial Guard regiment's heroic sacrifice, Every planetary defense against Xeno's invasion takes on a different meaning when viewed through this lens. They're not heroes. They're performers in the galaxy's most sophisticated theater of cruelty. What does this say about the nature of hope and despair in Grimdark fiction? Hope exists as a seasoning for despair, carefully cultivated and maintained at optimal levels to maximize the nutritional value of suffering. Despair without preceding hope is bland, unsatisfying to the cosmic entities that feed on mortal anguish. Are the heroes of 40K actually just the most flavorful prey? Absolutely. The characters we admire most, Commissar Yarrick, Captain Titus, Inquisitor Eisenhorn, are valuable precisely because their resistance is so perfectly calibrated, so ideally desperate, so exquisitely hopeful that consuming them provides maximum nutrition to the forces they oppose. The most terrifying aspect of this revelation isn't that you might refuse to be eaten and fail. It's that you might refuse to be eaten and succeed, only to discover that your success was always part of someone else's meal plan. In the 41st millennium, even your victories serve your enemy's interests. Every escape is planned. Every moment of hope is cultivated. Every act of defiance is anticipated and integrated into more sophisticated consumption methods. The game is rigged not because the players are cheating, but because the rules themselves have evolved to make every possible move serve the house's interests. The galaxy doesn't want you to surrender because surrender is nutritionally inferior to resistance. It wants you to fight back with maximum creativity, maximum desperation, maximum hope, because fighting back is what makes you valuable as prey. And so we return to that moment in the darkness, to you hanging in biochains that pulse with alien hunger, to the choice that feels like the last expression of your free will. You understand now that the moment you decided to fight back, you became exactly what they wanted you to become. The chains weren't holding you for consumption, they were seasoning you for it. Your resistance wasn't defying the system, it was optimizing the system. Your refusal to be eaten wasn't heroic, it was delicious. But perhaps in this moment of terrible understanding, there is something approaching genuine defiance. Not in the choice to resist, which serves their interests, nor in the choice to surrender, which serves them differently but just as effectively. The defiance lies in understanding what your choices mean while making them anyway. You know your resistance will feed them. You know your suffering will teach them. You know your defiance will be used to torment countless others. And yet, in full knowledge of these consequences, you choose to resist anyway, not because it will change anything, but because the alternative is to become a willing participant in the cosmic machine of suffering. This is the only form of heroism possible in the 41st millennium, the choice to be tragic rather than complicit, to suffer meaningfully rather than surrender meaninglessly, to be consumed as a person rather than processed as a resource. And somewhere in the darkness, something vast and hungry smiles, because your resistance has just made you the most valuable meal in the galaxy. Your understanding of your situation doesn't diminish your worth as prey, it enhances it exponentially. In the grim darkness of the far future, knowledge is not power. Knowledge is seasoning. The feast begins now, and your resistance ensures it will never end.